So as competitive players, we tend to think about randomness as the enemy, that it overrides our skill expression in the game, and the strategies we pursue are an attempt to win as consistently as possible. And so there tends to be this opinion that games that have less randomness are therefore more skillful. But as game designers, we can approach this from a different perspective, and that's that randomness is a tool in our toolbox that we can utilize to create particular types of skill tests for players. And so today I thought we would take a deep dive into randomness to better understand what it is and how it works, but also hopefully to give players a perspective that randomness isn't the enemy that a lot of us seem to think that it is. Today's going to get pretty crunchy, so let's get into it.
Distraction makers.
First, I think it's important that we start with understanding the player perspective, because if we lose sight of the perception that players have, we can tend to override people's feelings about games generally, and we end up having designed a system that doesn't really resonate with players. So often, from a player's perspective, randomness does feel like it overrides skill. If a game comes down to a coin flip of maybe a single sub-game, and I lose that coin flip, therefore I've lost the game, my strategic agency has been removed, and the game systems, the randomness, right, has overridden my skill as a player. And don't get me wrong, this is definitely true, right? There are times when randomness does override your skill, and a less skillful player can win a game that maybe they shouldn't have won. In certain contexts, randomness can halt progress entirely. You're just not rolling the success, right? This is something that's seen more in loot-based games where you're attempting to find a particular drop for your character, and you're sort of grinding against these enemies, trying to get it to drop, and maybe eventually it does. But this is an instance where randomness is just a blanket hindrance to progress. And as an aside here, booster packs are this, effectively, right? This is one of the ways that booster packs helps to alleviate the queen problem being in a customizable game. Why would players not just choose all queens or the best piece, right? The best game pieces only. And so randomness is one way to sort of alleviate that, but in its worst case scenario, it can halt someone from progressing inside of a game systems. So I think those are the two major fail states to randomness. The two biggest drawbacks to randomness is that we can end up in a state where it overrides a player's skill entirely, or it halts a player's progress entirely. And there's a couple articles that are worth checking out. They'll be linked in the description, both written by Mark Rosewater. One is called Kind Acts of Randomness, and the other one is called Variance, which has two parts, part 1 and part 2. Mostly we're talking about part 1 here. So first, I think we need to define what randomness actually is before we can dive deeper into how to apply it as a concept. So I think as like a working definition of randomness, I think about it as an adjustable system force that neither player has full agency over that reduces a player's return to skill. And by returns to skill, I mean, how much does your skill impact the outcome? And randomness is one type of variance. There are a lot of different kinds of variance. Randomness is just one of them. And it's important that we understand that there's also a spectrum to randomness, right? Things can be more random or less random, but what are the knobs that we can turn to better understand how a specific instance of randomness will present itself? When we look at variance, and this is something presented by Mark Rosewater in his article called Variance, he plots variance on two different axes. One is the variance itself as the x-axis. How much variance does something have? Does it have only a single option, or does it have many options? And the other axis is, he says choice, but I'll use the term agency. That's usually the term that I would use when I'm discussing players' impact on a system. Types of variance can have lots of different outcomes, or it can have sort of just a few outcomes, or it can have lots of choice or no choice at all. And we can map randomness as one form of variance by these variables. And so when we think about the amount of agency that a player has in any given form of randomness, we can see this as, what choices can I make about how I engage with this randomness? The randomness itself probably doesn't have a whole lot of agency because it's random. If there was agency involved, then it would be a clear outcome. So can I choose to engage with this at all? I have multiple different actions that result in some kind of randomness that I can choose. This is usually like a Warhammer scenario, right? Where I'm choosing to engage with different units that I may or may not have better odds of beating. Or is this I must take this action? And this tends to be like, all right, we're at the beginning of the game. Who's going to go first? We need this instance of randomness to determine who gets to be the first player. And so you might flip a coin or roll a die, whatever you're going to do. And then we can think about the variance and different outcomes from this instance of randomness. Do we flip a coin, which it's just a binary, is it heads or tails? Or do we roll a d6? And if we roll a d6, we have 6 different outcomes, theoretically. This could also scale accordingly, that we could have a d20 or something, and that has 20 different outcomes. And using that sort of knob of how many different outcomes do we want this instance of randomness to have, that can impact the player's decision, right? Like, how likely is it that I succeed? Another way to think about this could be that when you're playing in a game that has an amount of randomness, you are playing against not only the other player, but you're also kind of playing against the system. And I think this is where really competitive-minded players that are maybe more interested in a game like chess tend to butt up against the idea that a system can intervene in the game in some way to sort of muddy the waters in terms of who is the better player. And I think this can lead to this perception that luck and skill are sort of opposing forces, right? Like, the more randomness, the more luck that you have in a game, the less skillful it is. But if we really want to illustrate the fact that skill can still have an impact on a game that uses randomness, we can use Richard Garfield's example, which is this idea that you can play a game of chess, and then at the end of it, you can flip a coin, and the winner of the coin flip wins the match. Well, that's an amount of randomness that completely reduces the returns to skill, and that game of chess basically didn't matter, right? Or we can play a game of chess, and then at the end of it, we can roll a d6, and if a 6 is rolled, the loser of the chess game wins the match. And then we can see that the outcome of that chess game did have impact on the randomness at the end, on that die roll, because now the person who won the chess game has a 5 out of 6 chance to actually win the game. A small note on input and output randomness. This is, I think, a dynamic that is often discussed as good or bad types of randomness, where input randomness is often seen as the better form. And this comes back to the player perception of the randomness is happening before I make a critical decision rather than after, where output randomness is I've made a critical decision and then the outcome of that decision is random. This is basically the difference between drawing a card at the beginning of your turn, that's an input randomness, versus, again, with like something like Warhammer, where I have charged or shot at an enemy unit and I roll the dice to figure out how much damage I've done. That would be output randomness. But as long as randomness is sort of leading into other subgames, output randomness can the line here is a bit more blurred, right? Where if we look at a subgame as I'm engaging with my opponent's units and I'm going to see how well I do in that combat, that becomes input randomness for the next subgame, right? I understand now the outcome of that decision that was output randomness, and now I can use that as input for my next decisions. And so as long as there's additional subgame to be had, output randomness can sort of blur the lines as to whether it's input or output. And where you would want to use these different types of randomness gives different feelings to systems, right? Playing Magic the Gathering feels different than playing Warhammer, and this is part of the reason why. So let's come back to this idea, right, that we play this game of chess and then we roll a d6, and on a roll of a 6, the loser of the chess game wins, and how unfair that feels to players. And I think part of that is because that instance of randomness is so acute, right? There's not another subgame to be played based on that output randomness. But if we put that at the beginning of the game and it becomes input randomness, then we have basically a roll to see who goes first, or a coin flip, or whatever it is, right? And that's an instance of sort of input randomness. I'm going to go first, therefore I am advantaged in most games. And we tend to think that that didn't have the sort of same kind of impact than if we had, made another roll at the end of the game. And I think that's that subgame input-output dynamic at play. But also, that feeling of unfairness, I think we can investigate whether or not that is even accurate, right? Is it unfair if the system sort of reaches its hand in and decides that one player over the other will win the game, in the case of rolling that 6 at the end of the chess game? And I think this also depends on this kind of multiple game dynamic, right? If we are to play many games, right, over time, that system force of randomness and choosing the sort of less skilled player as the winner will just be noise in the data collection of who is the better player. I think another way to say this is that if a system produces a 51-49% outcome in favor of skilled players, that will ultimately be the same as a 60-40 split or a 100-0 split over enough data, right? Over enough games, over enough time, that disparity in the ability for skilled players to win more games, not all the games, but win more games, will ultimately still produce who is the better players at the game. It will just take more time. And this is called the law of large numbers. It basically just means that over time and with enough data, you can see kind of what the actual relative truth is. There's another sort of important concept here, and it's that there's an illusion of non-randomness. And what I mean by this is that even games that are perceived as having next to no randomness still have randomness, right? There's still an amount of random input that goes into those games. For instance, in chess, that random input is we're going to determine randomly who goes first. Some systems determine this based on, I don't know, who's supposed to be the most skilled or whatever it is, but there's sort of rippling implications for how that's chosen to begin with. There's also all sorts of environmental factors, like did you sleep through your alarm that morning? Were you too anxious to sleep the night before? I suppose some of that could be a skill issue, but or was there like a car accident that delayed you from getting to practice on time and now you're flustered because you didn't have the ability to get as much prep in as you wanted, right? Those kinds of things are quite similar to a system force imposing randomness upon a game. It's just that one is sort of artificial, right? It is a system creating that force instead of sort of just like random events happening to you outside of the game systems. But there's also this game state that's worth talking about that complex games, I think, attempt to end up in, right? And this is with some of my conversations with some of the chess players in our Discord, where they were basically pushing back against this idea that randomness is good or that it could be good, that they definitely saw it as sort of an illegitimate force being applied to a game system. But the state that I'm describing is there's basically what's called prep, which is that you have memorized a certain amount of the moves in chess so that when you're in a particular position, you'll know what your sort of best options are to navigate the game to a position that's better in your favor. And there's this sort of mental dance that happens with your opponent. You're sort of unsure if your opponent has run out of prep or not, or you have, and you're trying to not let your opponent know that you have to navigate back to prep that you do have. And I've heard this described in a couple different ways. One, I've heard this referred to as Yomi, which is, I think, more of the fighting game community side of this, where it's effectively trying to sort of read your opponent's mind. I've heard it as both a Japanese word and also as an acronym, meaning your only move is. I don't know how much of this is true. I know game designer David Serlin has used this term extensively. He also has games named after it and things. But I do think that it's sort of just more of a fighting game community term for this concept that I'm describing. And the other side of this is what's referred to as donkey space. And donkey space was coined by Frank Lantz. I think donkey space is actually just a part of Yomi. I think these concepts are similar, but a little different. And donkey space is specifically referring to making suboptimal moves to make your opponent think that you don't know what you're doing or that you've run out of prep. And the most famous example here is the poison scene in Princess Bride, where he's trying to determine which cup is poisoned based on psychological whatevers, right? But I think we can also view this game state involving some amount of randomness. And it's different. It's presented in slightly a different way. But the idea is that, all right, well, let's say you have run out of prep, but you happen to make a guess at what you think the best move might be, and so you make it, and it ends up being the better move. Was that your skill, or was that randomness? That game state, I think, is at the core of what randomness attempts to create in a game, but it attempts to create it without the sort of prep lead up necessary to get us to that game state of, I am operating off of heuristics and intuition, and adapting to situations rather than acting merely on memorization. I shouldn't say merely, rather than acting on my prep or my memorization. And so that leads us to this idea of skill testing and different fail states, right? It's what are the fundamental skills that these different systems are testing. And I'd argue that the most important skill to a system that is high random, as long as it includes some amount of skill, is your adaptability, right? If these, as I was saying before, right, we have sort of these different forces that can be applied to the game. It's your opponent, it's also the system. In the case in a system that has a lot of randomness, when that randomness falls outside of your favor, can you navigate back to a position where you are favored again to win the game? That adaptability and that testing of heuristic mastery and risk assessment is where randomness really shines. And it's not to say that chess doesn't get into that same state. It's just that it gets there in a different way. It gets there through overwhelming complexity. Once players have exhausted prep, that's when you have to rely more on that adaptability and the heuristics to get yourself back to positions where you do see the line of play to get to the end state. I actually think these things have a lot more in common. It feels like people on the random side of this think that chess is a sort of a solved game. It doesn't have the sort of strategic complexity because you can just memorize everything. And it feels like on the other side of it, chess players think that randomness overrides any skill, so why bother, right? But really, it feels like you're both ending up in like both of these camps are ending up in a similar state. It's just how they get there is different, right? Like, I don't know. And then, the skill test of a game that is very low randomness, very low luck, it tests quite a bit more memorization. It tests quite a bit more prep. And your ability to sort of stay in this state where you know the moves that you should make. And I've heard that like Magnus Carlsen has gotten to this point where he would rather experiment with random chess, with the pieces in your back row being randomly determined at the beginning of the game, so that you can enter this state where there isn't the prep doesn't matter as much. You can operate more on intuition and heuristics. So let's talk a little bit about heuristics mastery for a minute. And I think this is sort of the skill tree, right, that you climb in a game that has high randomness. And a beginner in heuristics just doesn't really understand heuristics at all. Maybe they understand very basic heuristics of the game. In Magic, this might be something like I should attack before I play my creatures or something, right? So that way I give my opponent less information. That's a pretty low-level heuristic that many beginner players might know, but there's not a lot of nuance and not a lot of complexity to it. An intermediate player probably knows the heuristics, but doesn't really know when they should deviate from them, right? Again, this is I should always play my spells after I've attacked to give my opponent less information. Well, sometimes playing those things before you attack means that your opponent has more mistakes they could make because now they have more choices. So giving yourself understanding that sometimes that possibility space changes based on your actions before your attack, right? Maybe you want to just play your land and attack so that your opponent thinks you might be capable of more spells because now that land is in play. And finally, an expert would know the heuristics and know when to break them, as I was describing, right? They would know that, if I play a land before I attack, there's a broader possibility space of what I might be able to play out of my hand that my opponent now has to account for, things like that. Or something like bolt the bird, right? Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you should bolt your opponent's birds of paradise. Sometimes you should aim that bolt at your opponent's face. The master of heuristics not only knows the heuristics, knows when to break them, but also knows when to utilize them in a way that can make their opponent think that they're doing something that they're not. And I think that is the connecting factor, right, between this idea of chess where we've run out of prep and we're sort of trying to figure out if our opponent has run out of prep or not, and we're able to have that dance and send your opponent signals that you may or may not know what you're doing or what you may or may not have, so that you can create openings for yourself. In a system that is high random, the system creates some of those openings, but it's up to your player skill to know when that has happened and how to take advantage of it. Okay, so we should get to the big elephant in the room, and that is non-games. Sometimes systems with very high randomness create what we refer to as non-games, which is basically a game that you might as well just not played because you lost it because there was way too much randomness that didn't go in your favor, and therefore the game is just sort of a nothing, right? Your opponent just steamrolls you. And the argument here is that you should look at these non-games as noise in the data collection like we talked about earlier, right? Where if a game's systems overall have just enough randomness to sort of make sure that skillful players do in fact win more often than less skilled players, but not 100% of the time, then this would just come out in the data collection over time, that these non-games are just adding noise to that system. I could see why that would be frustrating to players who just want their skill to be the only thing that matters. The solution to the fail state of non-games is that we must play more games, right? That in order to remove that noise from the data before we find what are the most optimal strategies, who are the best players, we must play more games because we have to collect enough data to know what is signal and what is noise. On the flip side, the fail state to games that are low randomness, and that data collection is much easier because we can see 100 to 0 that the skillful player always wins. The fail state is a solved game, right? Where it doesn't matter how many more games we play, the outcome will always be the same. The outcome will be that the most skillful player wins, the most optimal strategy wins, and that therefore we sort of end up at the same state of non-games, but there is no solution, right? The non-games are why bother, rather than, well, I'm not sure if that game was determined by the system or by the players, or I'm sure that the game was determined by the system, therefore we should play again so that we can get a game determined by the players. Okay, so I think that's about all I have to go over today, so let's just go back through and do some takeaways. So why randomness? Why use randomness as a tool? Why add it to your games? It is a system of entropy against playing the most optimal strategies and having the best players always win. Like it's not a bug, right? That's a feature. Because that's the case, you have many more system outcomes that are possible. There's a lot more instances where a player who might be more skillful might end up in a weaker position and must navigate their way through that weaker position to get back to the better position, ultimately win the game. In card games, we often look at this as like curving out, right? I get to play a 1-drop on turn 1, a 2-drop on turn 2, and a 3-drop on turn 3. And in Magic systems, sometimes you get to do that. And other times, you don't, because you didn't draw a land. And so this creates the need to play from a suboptimal position and try to determine how to win the game from that suboptimal position. And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you just lose. But over time, you can see that that is noise in the data collection. And eventually, the better players come out. The better strategies come out in the data. Randomness creates these unexpected situations that very quickly test players' adaptability and their mastery over heuristics, when they should use them and when they should break them, rather than sort of incentivizing players to rely only on memorization. Don't get me wrong, memorization is still a big part of Magic the Gathering, but there's another layer there, which is, what do I do when I've run out of prep? And that situation is sort of forced by the game systems, where I might be out of prep because I'm in a situation that the system has put me in, not a situation that my opponent has put me in. And I see that as the major dynamic here, that players who are against randomness tend to favor systems that don't put them in a suboptimal position because that is perceived as unfair. But I would, again, bring up that over time, that noise will come out of the data. It's also important to note that randomness can be frustrating, but we do have lots of ways to change the randomness so that player perception is that it is more fair, right? We're back to that input versus output random, and also, is it a coin flip or is it a spectrum of possibilities that tend to lean in one player's favor or in the other? And are we giving players enough agency that they can make that choice, right? It's up to the player as to whether or not they're going to engage with a more risky scenario or a less risky one. Okay, so that's a pretty broad overview of randomness. If you are making a game or you'd like to help others test their games, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description below. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.